All right, Micah chapter 3. Micah chapter 3. And I said, Hear, I pray you, O heads of Jacob, and ye princes of the house of Israel, is it not for you to know judgment? Who hate the good and love the evil, who pluck off their skin from off them, and their flesh from off their bones, who also eat the flesh of my people, and flay their skin from off them, and they break their bones and chop them in pieces as for the pot, and as flesh within the cauldron. Then shall they cry unto the Lord, but he will not hear them. He will even hide his face from them at that time, as they have behaved themselves ill in their doings. Thus saith the Lord concerning the prophets that make my people err, that bite with their teeth and cry peace, and he that putteth not into their mouths, they even prepare war against him. Therefore shall night be unto you, that ye shall not have a vision, and it shall be dark unto you, that ye shall not divine, and the sun shall go down over the prophets, and the day shall be dark over them. Then shall the seers be ashamed, and the diviners confounded. Yea, they shall all cover their lips, for there is no answer of God. And we'll stop right there at verse 7, talk about those verses, and then we'll pick up with verse 8 in just a minute. All right, these first 7 verses identify the leadership in the kingdom. There in verse 1, the heads of Jacob, the princes of the house of Israel. And then a little further, he talks about the prophets there in verse 5. So it is the leadership against which this third chapter is addressed. Not just the king, not just the high priest, but all the heads. That would be the princes. That would be the judges who sit in the gate. That would be the prophets who prophesy, whether a prophet like Micah on a special calling, or the schools of the prophets as they had existed since the days of Samuel, where there were just many prophets, not all of whom were true prophets. And that's the reality here, that these prophets are not true prophets. And Micah says, I said, Hear, I pray you, O heads of Jacob, you princes of the house of Israel. He's talking to the southern kingdom. He's not addressing the northern kingdom. When we came out of chapter 1 there at the end, with those verses at the very end of the book, beginning at verse 10, declare ye not it in Gath, the focus began to be upon Judah. And I think that's still where it is, even though he had introduced Samaria in the early parts of chapter 1, he seems now to be focused on Judah. Judah is like Israel. Israel's going into captivity, so you need to pay attention and see what's going to happen to you. There's still an opportunity for you to repent. But the heads of Jacob, the princes of Israel, is it not for you to know judgment or to know justice? All right, when we go to court, what do we expect to get? Justice. But the common saying among most attorneys and judges is you don't go to court for justice. You go to God for justice. You go to court for a decision. You don't go there for justice. And so it's a cynical outlook, but it's somewhat the truth. Corruption and all these things that affect the way people behave and act. Justice is not always just. And that's what he's saying here. You're supposed to know what's right. You're supposed to be administering righteousness or justice. And is it not for you to know that? It's a rhetorical question, how it's phrased in the King James. And the point is, you're supposed to know. Turn over there, if you will, to the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, and verse 15, I think it is. Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. But in righteousness shalt thou judge thy neighbor. That's the principle of justice. We talk about it in this country. Everyone is equal before the law, regardless of how much money you got in your pocket. But that's not always true, see. And it wasn't then. And what they were doing They were taking bribes, and they were oppressing those who were trying to do what was right, or those who were poor, or those who were widowed or orphaned. And he says, is it not for you to know judgment, who hate the good and love the evil? Man, that's a terrible thing. Who hate what is good. And there are people like that. We had read earlier in chapter 2. These same fellows are doing what? They're staying up late at night trying to figure out how to do something that's evil. They're wholly bent on what they can do for themselves. And sadly, that's oftentimes the case when corruption gets into places of power or positions of influence. Is the only reason why some people seek those places is so they can do what? Profit. Provide for themselves. The idea of a public servant is kind of foreign to the thinking of some people. So he says of these leaders, these judges, these princes, they hate the good, they love the evil. And then, I'm always reminding people that most of the expressions that we have in English that are so common that we know and are very familiar with, we get them from the Bible. Have you ever said or talked about somebody who was taken advantage of, and you say, well, so-and-so skinned him alive? And now listen to this. Who pluck off their skin from off them, and their flesh from off their bones, who also eat the flesh of my people, and flay their skin from off them. They break their bones and chop them in pieces as for the pot, and as flesh within the cauldron. He's not talking about literal cannibalism. But he's talking about skinning them alive. Their oppression of these weak members of society is such that they are as if they were skinning them alive. The pain, the agony of that process. There are people who literally skin other folks alive and have done that. And when that happens, it's generally regarded by civilized folks as being uncivilized and cruel, and we don't want that to happen. But that is how the prophet is describing what Isaiah admonishes Israel. It says, you need to learn to do well, to seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow. And this is what they're not doing, you see. So Micah and Isaiah are contemporaries, and they're talking about the oppression that's going on in the nation. Isaiah's in the central city. He's in the seats of government and power and the places of spirituality and religion. And so he sees this corruption. But here's Micah. He's out in the countryside where it's being felt, where it's being experienced. And he's talking about these wicked leaders who are oppressing the citizens. Look at, you will, at a couple of passages here. I want you to look at Psalm 82, 1 through 5. This is where the psalmist, this is kind of unusual. The psalmist is, of course, he does oftentimes in voice complain about things. But listen to what he says here. This is Asaph. He says, God standeth in the congregation of the mighty. He judgeth among the gods. And this is the text that Jesus is referring to in John when he says that the Father referred to you as gods. Why are you saying that it's wrong for me to call myself the Son of God? In other words, he talked to the leaders of the people and called them gods. And this is that passage. So how long will you judge unjustly and accept the persons of the wicked? Defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy. Deliver the poor and needy. Rid them out of the hand of the wicked. They know not, neither will they understand. They walk on in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are out of course. I have said ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. But ye shall die like men, and shall fall like one of the princes. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for thou shalt inherit the nations. And so the judges, the gods, lowercase g, the Elohim, will be judged by the God. And they're called that because they stand in the place of God. They are to be rendering God's judgment. The whole system of judgment in Israel. Remember when Moses instituted it, all the people were coming to him every day. And his father-in-law said, Moses, you're going to kill yourself. I'm paraphrasing. You need to divide the labor. Well, he set up judges of thousands, judges of hundreds, judges of tens. And he said, any matter that's too hard for you, then bring that to me, and we will inquire of God. And in Numbers 15, we see a case of that when it comes down to the application of the law of the Sabbath to the fellow who was picking up sticks. They brought him to Moses. Moses made inquiry. And the ruling was he was to be stoned. And so this is the system of judgment that was to exist in Israel. Every one of them was in the cities, in the gates, whether it was the princes or it was the priests, were to be rendering judgment. And here they are executing evil. Now, look at a couple of passages here on this idea of being skinned alive. In Matthew chapter 7, we'll start in the New Testament. Jesus says, beware of false prophets. He calls the prophets that. He said, beware of false prophets because they are what? Wolves in sheep's clothing. Well, what does a wolf do? A wolf is vicious. You've seen enough movies. I've seen enough movies that when the wolves start to howl and they start to circle, it's a horrifying thing. And they attack in packs and pull their prey down. And so they're vicious. They destroy these people. Likewise, let's see here. I'm getting ahead of myself. Sometimes I do that. Let's look at Pardon me? Yeah, Matthew 7:15 is what I just referred to. I'm thinking here of, let's see if this is right. I've got some passages in Ezekiel. Turn over here to Ezekiel, chapter 22, I think. Verse 6. Behold, the princes of Israel, every one were indeed to their power to shed blood, and thee have they set light by father and mother. In the midst of thee have they dealt by oppression with the stranger. In thee have they vexed the fatherless and the widow. They have despised mine holy things, and has profaned my Sabbaths. Then drop down to verse 27. Her princes in the midst thereof are like wolves, ravening the prey, to shed blood and to destroy souls, to get dishonest gain. And her prophets have daubed them with untempered mortar, seeing vanity and divining lies of them, saying, thus saith the Lord God, when the Lord hath not spoken. So here you've got these rulers who are doing these evil deeds, and they're likened unto these ravening wolves. And then you've got the prophets over here who are pictured as plasterers, who are covering up the spots on the wall, and it's not going to stick. It's a whitewash deal, is what he's saying. And so this is what you have. You have the prophets and you have the princes, more or less working in league with one another. But they hate the good, they love the evil, they eat the flesh of my people, they've skinned them alive. And then let's look at that Ezekiel 23:24. I wrote that in the margin of my Bible last night, so I want to look at it for sure. Ezekiel 23:24, and they shall come against thee with chariots, with wagons and wheels, and with assembly of people which shall set against thee the buckler and the shield and the helmet round about, and I will set judgment before them, and they will judge thee according to your judgments. Okay, that's leading us into the next verse. All right, so he says, this is what they've done. Then verse 4 says, they shall cry unto the Lord, but he will not hear them. They, that is, these princes, will cry. Not the people who are being flayed alive. God's hearing them, the injustices that they're suffering. That's why the prophet is being sent. But he will not hear the cry of those who are guilty here. He will even hide his face from them at that time. They have behaved themselves ill in their doings. Thus says the Lord concerning the prophets. Right. So here's what they've done. They're going to get back what they gave. What does Jesus say when he talks about judging righteous judgments? He says, as you have judged, so shall ye be judged. And if you haven't had any mercy, how are you going to be judged? Without mercy. And so that's the idea here. These judges, I'm not going to hear them when they cry to me. When are they going to cry? Well, they're going to be crying when the Assyrians come. And then later when the Babylonians come. They're going to be crying out for mercy. Help us, help us. And they're going to receive just exactly what they've given out. And there's some great lessons on that point. This is what the Lord is telling us when he talks about, as you've judged, so shall you be judged. Sometimes the best thing to do is just let it pass. Look at Ephesians 4 and 32. Paul says, be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. It finally dawned on me one day. I can give grace because I surely have needed grace. And that's what Paul's telling these folks there at Ephesus. Forgive one another as I have forgiven you. Well, they haven't done anything to deserve forgiveness. When did you ever do anything to deserve forgiveness? What have you done to the Lord that you would merit that, you see? Well, you can't merit the grace of God. That's the whole point. Grace is unmerited favor. That's perhaps a tautology, but nevertheless, it's the truth. You don't earn favor. That's an oxymoron. Somebody says, well, I owe so-and-so a favor. How can you owe a favor? If you were given a favor and you owe for the favor, it never was a favor in the first place, was it? You owe a debt. And if that's how you feel about what people do for you, well, I owe so-and-so because I owe him a favor. No, you owe him a debt if that's the way you feel about it. And that's what we've got to come to realize is that we all have been the recipients of grace and mercy, long-suffering, forgiveness. Thus, it behooves us to be gracious, merciful, long-suffering, and forgiving. And when we allow society to become, or we contribute to the society, that we don't ever forgive anybody, we don't ever show anybody any mercy, we don't ever suffer the wrong, even though it is wrong, then that's how we're going to be judged. We're in need of grace and mercy. And so these fellas, they want God's grace. They want God's mercy. They want to be delivered, but God says, no. In that day I will not hear you. I will hide my face from them at that time because they have behaved themselves ill in their doings. Then in verse 5, he takes up the prophets. Thus saith the Lord concerning the prophets that make my people err, that bite with their teeth. Here again, these ravening wolves. Their false teaching, and this is why we have to be so concerned about this, because he goes on to say there that they cry peace, yet prepare war. And I'll talk about that phrase in just a minute. They cry peace. Isaiah talks about it. Paul quotes it in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 3, talking about the false teacher who says peace, peace, when there is no peace. All right? And the application in 1 Thessalonians 5 is to their behavior. In chapter 4, he's talking about sanctification. Then in verse 3 of chapter 5, the day of the Lord is coming, and he says, when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. So here's this false teacher who's preaching peace. Says you don't need to worry about Christ coming. You don't need to worry about your behavior. You don't need to worry about correcting your manner of life. So there's the idea of peace. Everything's okay. Don't worry about it. But then what happens? Comes upon them like the travail of a woman. You ladies who've had children know what that means. And so suddenly the judgment falls upon them. So here the same thing. The prophet, he devours with the teeth and they cry, peace. He's trying to lull them into safety and security, to give them the idea that there's no need to be concerned about what Micah is preaching. Here's Micah. He's going all over the land. He's telling people, Jeremiah 26:18 expresses this. Micah in his day preached the destruction of Jerusalem. He said, don't worry about Micah. He's a nut. Don't worry about what Micah is saying. Don't be concerned about that. Peace and safety. And sometimes we have that same kind of thing today. Don't be concerned about these doctrines that are being taught, or don't be concerned about these practices that are being encouraged, or don't be concerned about the fact that we're not saying a lot about certain sins, because those things don't matter. We just need to be focusing on positive things, good things, sweet things. Or as I said, prophesy unto us smooth things. Prophesy unto us deceits. I don't think all preaching has to be hellfire and brimstone, and I certainly don't believe the preacher needs to get up and berate the church every time he gets in the pulpit. But the reality is that we need to be talking about sin, and we need to be talking about error, and we need to be talking about what to do to be saved. People need to be confronted with the truth about these things. That doesn't necessitate being unsympathetic or unconcerned or overly harsh, but to just simply ignore those things and just preach peace, peace, when there is no peace. That's like the watchman on the wall illustration that Ezekiel gives. If I tell you to cry out and you don't cry out, just as the watchman on the wall doesn't cry out when the enemy approaches, well, their blood's going to be on your hands. But if you cry out and they will not listen to you, then their blood is on their own hands. So we have a responsibility to preach the whole counsel of God. So the prophets, they make my people err. That's how they bite with their teeth. They're devouring them. That's that false prophet, that sheep, that wolf in sheep's clothing. I'll get it out there in a minute. And cry peace, and he said, and he that putteth not into their mouth, they even prepare war against him. Some versions say sanctify war against him. Daniel 9:26 is a passage where that occurs, as well as Isaiah chapter 13, verse 3. The idea of sanctifying war or setting apart war. It's talking about God's activity in the kingdoms of men, and that's clearly what it is in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 26. You have the angels appearing to Daniel, telling him how this kingdom's going to fall, and this kingdom's going to rise, and this kingdom's going to fall, and this other kingdom's going to rise, and then the kingdom of heaven is going to be established. And so this sanctifying of war, this God's movements in the kingdoms of men. So here, this prophet, if you're paying him, if you're putting food in his mouth, he's going to prophesy just good stuff. Whatever, But you cut him off, and now he's going to sanctify war against. He's going to start preaching doom. And that's what these fellows have learned in Micah's day, is if we want to be on the payroll, if we want to be getting everything we want out of this deal, then we need to be preaching what people want to hear. That's what Paul said would happen in the New Testament church, that there would be those who would want their ears tickled. And so they preach a doctrine or preach a gospel that tickles people's ears. They depart from the faith. They give heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils and speaking lies and hypocrisy. They teach this error, which is what men want to hear. Paul, even when he comes to, I think it was Thessalonica. What is it? 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Yeah. Our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile, but as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak not as pleasing men, but God which trieth our hearts. For neither at any time use we flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak of covetousness. God is witness, nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. Paul said, we didn't come here to profit from you. We didn't come here to make merchandise of you. We did not use our office as an opportunity for our own personal enhancement. But these false prophets in Micah's day, they've learned that. They've learned that if we preach what the people want to hear, then we get the big pulpits. We get the big churches. We get the big salaries, and we can put lots of people in the building because we're not preaching anything that's calling upon them to have to make the commitment. So that 2 Timothy 4 passage, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. Let me tell you something. I'm a good enough preacher on a day that I get plenty of sleep and all of that. I'm a good enough preacher anymore. I could fill this building up if I wanted to. I can tell enough funny stories and be eloquent enough, if it serves the purpose, to just draw them in here. But that's not what I'm here for. I'm not here to entertain. I'm not here to draw a crowd. I'm not here to do anything other than to teach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so there are people who will not endure sound doctrine. So a fellow who's concerned about how many people are in the pews and how much his salary is going to be, what's he concerned? Is he concerned about sound doctrine? Is he just concerned about doctrine? See? But after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears. So here's a teacher who will preach to their lust. And this is why there are churches that are filled with people who are in marriages that aren't scriptural. This is why there are churches where social drinking is practiced among some of the members. This is why there are churches where error is tolerated, whether it's error with respect to the gospel, the terms of admission into the kingdom, any number of things. When I was in Amarillo years ago, and had the call-in radio program, one of the great problems in the institutional churches around, and you could understand why, because they'd given up on Bible authority, they were debating amongst themselves whether they could receive people with denominational baptism. And there was one congregation in the city that was perfectly willing to do that. And they were burgeoning, and because their preacher was not going to preach the truth on that subject. And so they have these itching ears who heap to themselves teachers, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth and be turned unto fables. Well, I know what a fable is. A fable's a myth. Fable's a story. It sounds good. It entertains, but what? It's not the truth. There may be some truth in it somewhere along the way, but it is not the truth. So these fellows who are out seeking to be paid, they love everybody except the fellow who opposes them. And that's the guy they declare war on. That fella, God loves everybody. God wants everybody to be saved. God is grace and mercy and love and truth. And then the fellow says, but wait a minute, the Bible says he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. God's going to condemn you, fella. You're causing trouble. See, this is the way these teachers act. They love everybody but the fellow who preaches the truth. Now then, he says, then shall the seers be ashamed and the diviners confounded. In verse 6, he calls them prophets. In 7, he calls them seers and diviners. In the old time, in book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, when Saul is out looking for his father's asses, and he comes to the city of Samuel, and they ask, where is the seer? And then there's an explanation that a prophet was called a seer in the old times. That may be true, but that's not how it's not generally used that way in the Old Testament. And particularly when it's joined this word diviner, the idea of divination. That may involve casting chicken bones or reading pig entrails. You ever know anybody said they could read the tea leaves, That's divination. When Joseph sent his brothers away, he said, put his goblet in one of the boys' sacks, Benjamin's sack. And they found it. And he said, that's the cup wherewith I divine. And the practice in ancient times was to pour water in the cup and slosh it around and kind of like the old crystal ball thing. I see thus and such in the water. This is divination. So I'm thinking that what he's describing here is because he says, the sun shall go down over the prophets and the day be dark over them. God's not going to talk to them anymore. God's cutting these false teachers off. Perhaps so they had been true prophets, but now because they're on the payroll, kind of like those fellas up there that Ahab had on the payroll, said, bring them in here. And they all told him what he wanted to do. And they said, well, go out and get Micaiah. And they brought Micaiah in. He told them the same thing. He said, he got mad at him. He says, how many times have I told you to only tell me the truth? And his complaint to Jehoshaphat had been, says, this fellow always prophesies evil against me. Well, out of his own mouth, he says, the evil he prophesies against me is the truth, you see. He knew it was the truth. And so these fellas, they were like Micaiah. They were getting thrown in prison and being fed bread and water, and they didn't like that, so they started preaching what Ahab wanted to hear. And when they went down to get Micaiah, the head dog says, now look, when you come up here, everybody has told the king exactly what he wants to hear, so you get on board. And that's just politics. That's all that is. But that's how these guys are operating. They're telling the people what they want to hear, and they said, look, don't disagree with the main line. This is the party line. Stick with it. And so now they've turned to being diviners and seers. They're reading pig entrails and casting chicken bones to see what the future is going to be. Because there is no answer of God. Now, verse 8, Micah starts talking about himself. He says, but truly I am full of power by the Spirit of the Lord, and of judgment and of might, to declare unto Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin. Hear this, I pray you, ye heads of the house of Jacob, princes of the house of Israel, that abhor judgment and pervert all equity. They build up Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. The heads thereof judge for reward, the priests thereof teach for hire, and the prophets thereof divine for money. Yet will they lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? None evil can come upon us. Therefore shall Zion, for your sake, be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountains of the house as the high places of the forest. Now Micah says, I am telling you what the Spirit of God says. All these other fellas, they're on the payroll. They're telling you what they want to hear. He's laying it out here, making it clear. You're listening to the wrong people. You need to listen to me because I am speaking by the power of the Spirit of the Lord and of judgment, that is righteousness, and of might. The idea there of what is authorized, what is instituted to be. In other words, I'm telling you what the law and the testimony of God is. And that's how Isaiah starts out there in his book, to the law and to the testimony. Isaiah 1, verse 18, where I was reading a moment ago. It says, I am full of these things to declare unto Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin. And there's another one of those Hebraisms, just the same thing said differently twice. Look at Isaiah 58 and verse 1. Cry aloud, spare not. Lift up thy voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins. That's the duty of the prophet. Cry aloud, spare not. Without favor. You tell people what's right. You tell them what they need to hear. You tell them what I tell you. So hear this. I pray you, the heads and the princes, who abhor judgment, justice, righteousness, and pervert all equity. They're twisting the law. They're oppressing. And here's the contrast between Micah and these false prophets in verses 5 through 7. And he's even contrasting himself with these priests and princes as well, because he's preaching judgment. Here's what God says. Here's what you must do. And so there's a great contrast between himself and the majority. And it's always that way. We've kind of been on a, I don't know, in a lull or a misconception for a lot of years in this country as far as the church is concerned, that somehow the vast majority of people are concerned about what's right. No, the vast majority of people have never been concerned about what's right. Maybe we haven't been as aware of corruption. Or maybe corruption has just gotten the upper hand and now we're on the receiving end of it a little more. But it's always been this way. The righteous, the children of God, have always been in the minority. And the truth is when we are the counterculture, that's when we do the best. And so we need to be standing out. And we need to be letting people know what righteousness is. And we need to be letting people know what the gospel is. It says, these fellows build up Zion with blood. There's their oppression. They found a house or a city with oppression, with blood. There's several references to that. Jeremiah 22:13. I want to look at that for sure. I've got it underlined here. Jeremiah 22:13. Woe to him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by wrong, that use his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work. Oppression. You don't pay a fair wage. You don't treat a fellow fairly. Then Ezekiel 22:27. Her princes in the midst thereof are like wolves, ravening the prey, to shed blood and to destroy souls, to get dishonest gain. So there it is. This is how they're building by blood, through this oppression. You know, see, that puts the Christian in a hard place, because he's got to do right, and oftentimes he has to take wrong. That's not a very good place to be, is it? But that's where we often end up. And the temptation is, well, he wrongs me, so I'm going to wrong somebody else. No. The fact that he may cheat on what he provides or delivers or the service that he gives, that doesn't allow you to do it. See? We're responsible to be honest, upright, just, righteous. We cannot build our house with blood. See, I got another reference back here to Amos chapter 5 and verse 11. See if I remember what that is. All right, this is talking about the oppressors in the northern kingdom. For as much, therefore, as your treading is upon the poor, and you take from him burdens of wheat, and you've built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not dwell in them. Ye have planted pleasant vineyards, but ye shall not drink the wine of them. All right, there's their judgment. We cannot be taking advantage of these poor, weak, oppressed persons in our society. All right, now then, he comes on. Verse 11. The heads thereof judge for reward, a bribe. The priests thereof teach for hire. So much preach, so much pay. And the prophets thereof divine for money. What do you want to hear? Here's how much it costs. Yet they lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? None evil can come upon us. Here's all this oppression. Here's all this wickedness. Here's all this evil in society. And that we are God's people. Jeremiah deals with that in, what was it, Jeremiah 7? Yeah. Jeremiah 7 in the temple sermon. The people are coming in, and Jeremiah, this is the visual image here is incredible. The people are coming into the gate, into the temple, and Jeremiah is standing there preaching. And he says in verse 8, behold, you trust in lying words that cannot profit. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, burn incense unto Baal, walk after other gods whom you know not, and come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered to do all these abominations? Is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, saith the Lord. And that's the passage Jesus quotes when he cleanses the temple. He's not talking about the fact that the money changers are being dishonest. He's talking about the whole fact that the religious system of the Jews has just fallen into complete and total corruption. And yet you come in this house and you say, we are God's people and God has delivered us. He's going to protect us because we're doing his will. He says, you think that's really the case? To lie, to steal, to commit adultery? So he concludes verse 12. Therefore shall Zion for your sake be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps.